This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. This is your weekly episode of Roots and All, and I apologise straight off for my wonky voice. It's not COVID, but I do have some illness which is affecting my airways and my ability to speak normally. So this week's guest is Harriet Carty. Harriet is the Charity Director and Beautiful Burial Ground Project Manager at Caring for God's Acre, an organisation which works nationally to support groups and individuals to investigate, care for and enjoy burial grounds and graveyards. These sites provide refuge for wildlife, veteran trees and plants. They're community assets which need protecting and preserving for us and for future generations, and I was fascinated to find out more about what's being done to look after these local treasures. Harriet starts by explaining more about the project.
So Caring for God's Acre is a conservation charity that specialises in burial grounds of all types. So that would be churchyards, chapel yards, cemeteries, Muslim and Jewish burial grounds, green burial grounds. I think we'd even consider a pet cemetery or two. So really any type of burial ground. And it sounds a sort of funny niche sort of area for a conservation charity, but there are an incredible number of them, and they're real hotspots for biodiversity, as well as being absolutely brilliant for built heritage as well. And they sort of hold the history of a community in a really tangible way. You know, it's the first place that somebody studying social history will go and have a look, is often the churchyard. So they're really important for a variety of reasons, but particularly for the biodiversity, I think.
Yeah, because quite often when you're reading books, people say, if you want to see this particular wildflower, which is rare, go to the churchyard, because I presume...
That's right.
I mean, Is it because they haven't been particularly disturbed over the years, or is it also because they are well looked after historically?
Well, it's a bit of both. You've sort of summed it up there, really. If you think of a churchyard might be the oldest piece of enclosed land in a parish. Even if the church is younger, the churchyard might well be Saxon. Not all of them by any means, but an awful lot of them are. And that land has been managed as grassland, probably with a stone wall around it, more or less consistently since then. So for many centuries it would have been closed up for a hay crop. We know this because there's records of the vicar getting the hay crop as part of their wages, and also vicars getting told off if they planted turnips in them. So by getting stroppy letters from the bishop. So we know that they'd have taken a hay crop from it, locked it up until early summer, cut it, and then grazed it lightly after that to keep it as grassland. And that's really what we do now. Some churchyards have short grass, some have longer grass, but it's managed grassland. And really, bar digging graves, which you often have the turf replaced, it's incredibly undisturbed. So it's both undisturbed, but not wilderness. It isn't left to nature, if you like. It's managed consistently down the centuries, and that is very, very precious and very rare now in our busy country full of all sorts of changes.
So are you a charity?
We are a charity, yes. Uh-huh. Yes, we are a charity. Yeah.
And in the long term, what are you hoping to achieve with the charity?
So we reckon that if you take all of the burial grounds together, it's a land holding about equivalent to the size of the Isle of Wight, or maybe Exmoor National Park. And that there's 20 to 25,000 of these burial grounds across England and Wales alone. So I would like to see every single burial ground do something for nature conservation, whether it's large or small. Just do something. And also sort of let the wider world, I think, know, and particularly the conservation world, know just how good they are. So we're trying to collect data on them as well, get people out there doing citizen science with an aim of trying to really sort of see how good that piece of land, the size of the Isle of Wight is. So I think that would be my aim. My aim would be to raise awareness in the scientific community of just what we have. Also for the landowners, the Church of England, Church in Wales, the local authorities with their cemeteries, but as well, just try and nudge everybody into a little bit slightly greener way of managing, but without losing that continuity of management. Still managing, but perhaps in a slightly gentler way for some people, slightly more historic management rather than manicured.
This was a later question, actually, but if you did have a local church, could you make sure they were signed up? And if not, how would somebody go about it?
Well, we sort of offer a lot of advice. We'll offer phone, email support. So I suppose the thing to do would be to talk to the vicar or somebody, the church warden perhaps, and you often get a contact name on the notice board, and just sort of ask them, have they heard of God's Acre? Would they like to get in touch? Perhaps have a look on our website first, download some of our resources and sort of say, there's a lot of resources here, could I share some with you? One thing to remember is that almost all burial grounds have a lot of volunteers, and that actually now includes the big cemeteries. There's an awful lot that are managed in part by friends groups, perhaps with support from the local authorities. So always be a bit sensitive if you're talking to a volunteer who perhaps puts in many, many, many hours. If somebody walks through the gate and says, I've got some ideas for you, they're often not very well received. But if you sort of go through and a bit carefully and perhaps offer to help with, say, picking up the grass or something like that, you're more likely to get a result, I think. But we would encourage people, just ask them if they've heard of us and would they like to get in touch and, see if we can help in any way. We also think it's really important that, particularly for churchyards, management often falls on the church community. They're the landowner, so on the face of it, that seems quite reasonable. But, congregations are often shrinking, particularly rural ones. The demographic is aging. So it's sort of falling on a smaller and smaller group of older people. And so we would argue that it's the whole community's burial ground. It's the history of a whole community. Yes, of course, it's a churchyard and it is actually owned by the church. But it'd be great if people help with these really special places and the wildlife within them, whether or not they had any connection with the church at all. And usually you'll find that actually the church community really welcome that. They love volunteers from every walk of life.
Mm. And do you know roughly what percentage of churches you're in contact with or who have come to you for advice?
I don't really, to be honest. We have a membership of a few hundred. We reach thousands with our e-newsletters. We have an awful lot of hits on our website and an awful lot of downloads. But no, I don't actually know. Because it's a sort of like throwing a pebble into a pond, and you don't quite know where the ripples are going to go, who it's going to touch, who's going to get involved, how involved they're going to be. So we don't sort of have a list of our burial grounds, if you like. We just always try to sort of influence people and support them and help them and encourage them. We did have a recent initiative with which we did with the Church of England and Church in Wales, and also a charity called a Rocha, called Churches Count on Nature, where we just encourage people to do some sort of wildlife activity during a national week that we run called Love Your Burial Ground Week. And over 520 churchyards took part. And considering they had to plan it without knowing what COVID restrictions there were on, we thought that was absolutely amazing. That really gave us an idea just how much interest there is out there. That many people took part in the first year with restrictions in place, because it was in early June. So yeah, I think there's a lot of interest.
Yeah. And when you advise people, I'm guessing it's very site specific, but are there certain ways of managing the land that you would like to see?
Well, I think there are certain ways of managing the grassland. That's the main thing that gets managed, is the grassland. And the grassland in burial grounds is really special because, as you probably know, we've lost almost all of our traditional meadows. We reckon there's only about 3% left of the meadows that were there in the 1930s. And churchyards contain it, as actually do cemeteries as well. Any land that was sort of consecrated before, say, the Second World War or even the 1960s is probably this really precious, really rare meadow habitat. And so if people can let an area of it flower, they can manage an area of it for either medium length grass or, ideally a long grass and then a hay cut. They usually see the most fantastic show of wildflowers and all the pollinating insects and small mammals and birds that, associated with that habitat. So I think I would really encourage people to look closely at their grassland. It's not just grass. Often when you have a look, you see it's more flowering plants than grass. And the key thing to do with that is to pick up your grass cuttings. Don't leave them to mulch. Don't leave them lying there. Pick them up and take them away. And then you really keep and encourage those wildflowers.
What are some notable churchyards or grounds that you've worked with? Have you found that there are any particularly rare flowers or species that you've been involved with that you're really excited about?
You quite often find a nice array of orchids. You find some really rare ferns. Find things like adder's tongue ferns sometimes. Probably the rarest things that you'll find in churchyards. You often find a good load of grassland fungi, lots and lots of different wax caps. The lichens are probably the rarest, and I'm afraid I don't know the names of lichens. I can't identify them myself. There's about 2,000 of them, and they're really difficult. But in churchyards, we've got about a third of those 2,000 occur in churchyards, and some of them in no other places at all. So that's probably the sort of the rarest things that you're likely to find. But the other absolute cracker that churchyards particularly have is veteran trees. I mean, our oldest trees are in the churchyards of England and Wales, and that's the yew trees. And some of those are over, they're over 1,000 years old. Some of them predate Christianity, or Christianity in the UK. So suggesting a sort of earlier pagan site was, there before it became a churchyard. So I'd have said, if you want a real wow factor, have a look for some of these ancient and veteran yew trees. They really are special.
And what do you do? How can you help people look after their veteran trees?
There's various things to do. One is to be aware of what you've got, know about it, perhaps tell people about it. So interpretation is really important. Letting people know. You don't want to pile anything on the root plate. Actually, trees have really shallow roots. And if you put heavy weights on top of the roots or smother them, they don't like it at all. And quite often under the yew tree, because it has a really low, dense canopy, people will sort of pile a bit of old rubble there, or even put a shed up, or we found a big pile of old bottles under one. So don't put anything on the root plate. Do not decide it's a good place to park a few cars. That's a really helpful thing for the tree. Don't panic if it's got some dead wood in it. Do not, have a go at pruning it. Really seek a bit of specialist advice, because it could be thousands of years old, and you really don't want to be the person who lops a bit too much off it and kills it off or really knocks it back. So I think be aware of what a special thing you've got, celebrate it, and just treat it with respect it deserves, and really seek specialist help, and advice.
Are there TPOs on many of those ancient yews?
Surprisingly few, because they're not seen as being under threat, and indeed they're not really. They're not going to be felled for development or something like that, because TPOs tend to be on trees that are under threat, and that's a bit of a shame, really, because it means that when you've got something like a TPO on, you're put in touch with the tree officers within the council, who are extremely knowledgeable about management of trees. And so it perhaps would be more helpful if they were, but most of them don't have any sort of designation, which is why mistakes can happen, because people just don't realise what they're looking after. And some of them can look a bit sort of, they don't necessarily look like a great, mature, wonderful veteran oak. Some of them can look a bit sort of dead and mangy looking and sort of lumpy veteran yews. So mistakes can be made.
Obviously, in that sort of situation, if you do have some damage to a tree like that, and I'm thinking about the trees, but probably in general, it would be best to get someone in who was an expert to deal with it. But I'm thinking maybe there's some tension there if the funding to deal with it comes from the church funds. Is that how these things work?
It is. There's always a lot of tension around funding things in a churchyard, because actually the money needed for that comes from the congregation. It comes from people putting their weekly envelope in the plates during a church service. I mean, there are some pots of money within the church that people apply for, but not very much really. So yes, indeed, churches are on the whole, that, in terms of the management, the day-to-day management, they're usually very strapped for cash, actually. And I think that's something else that people don't realise, because you sort of see the Church of England, and you see a big institution that owns a lot of land, a lot of buildings, and you think, well, they must have a lot of money, but they don't have it available at a church by church or churchyard by churchyard basis. And similarly, for the cemeteries, these are owned by the local authorities on the whole. And, if you think of all the pressures on the local authority, the Victorian part of the churchyard is really going to be very low down the list of things. Even within land management, they're going to be wanting to mow school fields and mow the modern bits of the cemetery where people are visiting really regularly, or do tree surveys there or whatever. So they can be somewhat the bottom of the pile in terms of priorities and cash. So yes, it is a tension. But usually if you point out to somebody that they're looking after something that's over 1,000 years old, they kind of go, oh, golly, okay, fair enough. We think we need to sort of, at least get advice and then see what we can do rather than, having a go.
Yeah, because I'm thinking as well, is there any sort of funding available? Because obviously, if you are trying to argue the case for something to be protected, sometimes it's good to identify what you've got there in the first place. So, for example, if a church needed a biodiversity audit doing, could they get funding for that from anywhere?
Well, they couldn't get funding for exactly that, but we're running a project at the moment called the Beautiful Burial Grounds, and we've been working with the church and also with the National Biodiversity Network, the NBN. And we've got a portal within the NBN Atlas. The NBN is a sort of umbrella organisation for recording groups holding a huge millions of biological records. And so actually, if you go onto the NBN and look at the different atlases there, you'll see the Beautiful Burial Grounds has a page. And all of the burial grounds that we're aware of are mapped across England and Wales within this, with the records that are known to come from them. You can click on an individual, dot, and you can see what's been found in that particular cemetery or churchyard. So rather than paying for an audit, we're sort of encouraging people to do a bit of citizen science. And we've got some funds that can help you, say, pay for an expert to lead a training session. So it's more about training and helping people to do identification themselves and just discover this interesting place rather than paying an ecologist to just go in and write a report.
Yeah, and is that the only citizen science that you encourage people to get involved with? Are there other aspects to that?
Well, we'd always just encourage people to be out and looking, and particularly in burial grounds, and let us know what they see. So that's the area where we've currently got a bit of funding to help people with it, but it's quite a compulsive habit, really. And one of the brilliant things about burial grounds is they're incredibly accessible. They tend to be in the middle of a community. They tend to have full disabled access. They'll have some benches. Some of them have loos now. You've got a nice wall around it. If you're taking the kids in, they won't run off and disappear. So they're really excellent sites for, say, families to go and do a bit of exploring, or people who are perhaps have some mobility issues, and also they're free as well. Lovely. You just walk there on the whole, and then you go and have a potter around. So we'd always encourage people to just sort of, enjoy this brilliant green space, and also just, look out for things and take a note of what you see, and go a little bit deeper than by finding out a little bit about what's there. It always sort of enhances a visit, I think, when you've got a little bit more information about a place.
Yeah, I wonder if during COVID, a lot of people were just walking around their local area. And I know that I personally went to my local churchyard and had a walk around, which I've never done before. And actually the burial ground is separate across the road to the main church. So I also went to that part of it, and it was just amazing. It was so beautiful. But I almost feel, a little bit of me feels a little bit like I'm trespassing. And I wonder if there's still that thing attached where people are maybe a little bit nervous of going into one, because it just, it feels like a very respectful space. It doesn't necessarily feel like the sort of place that you could just go for a walk through for recreation purposes.
Yeah, totally. And people bring a lot of baggage, other baggage to it. So I think as a nation, we have quite a bit of baggage about death. We're not comfortable talking about death. We feel self-conscious or embarrassed if we see somebody who's obviously grieving and very upset. And also, if people aren't churchgoers, if this isn't their religious space, they slightly wonder whether, they should be there. But almost always, if you speak to the people who manage them, you speak to the vicars, you speak to the church wardens, they love people to be in there. They really welcome the fact that it's such a used sort of space. But I do think definitely, since lockdown, people have become far more aware of all of the green spaces in their area and just how important their area is. And they have, like you, I've discovered little nooks and crannies that you can get to by walking out the door that I'd never done, because I might have just sort of, jumped in the car and driven a few miles to a nature reserve or a bit of countryside or the Forestry Commission or something. So I think we did really discover a lot. I mean, interestingly, and this is from pre-COVID, more people visit churchyards just to be there, just to enjoy that space, than either people going into the church or visiting the grave of either somebody they know or somebody famous. So actually an awful lot of us were going into these places and just enjoying the peace, enjoying the bird song, enjoying the flowers, looking at the memorials, whatever. Just having a little bit of quiet away from the hubbub of life. So we were already doing it, and I think we're doing it far, far more now.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually. I wouldn't have, because I don't do it, I wouldn't have thought of it. But, obviously you spoke about, if you want to get involved, the best way probably is to start a conversation going with somebody who may or may not be a volunteer. If you were really wanting to get involved and kind of protect what is a community asset, is there any kind of more advice you could give? And I'm thinking also in terms of particular skill sets of people who might be involved.
I think get in touch with us. We'll be really happy to try and sort of help, to try and put you in touch with somebody useful. An awful lot of churchyards and cemeteries, as I say, do have volunteers working in them. So there's sort of conservation work to be done, nice jolly work parties to join in with. Or if they're not, suggest them, sort of say, well, could we come in and help with this? Or could we let an area of it grow long, of your mown grass grow long, when we'll rake it and we'll cut it and rake it in July? Things like that. So that I think there's a lot of practical help to be given. I think also, yes, identification of things, making a bit of a species list when you're there and letting people know if that's a skill you have. Schools can use them. They're brilliant outdoor classrooms, absolutely brilliant. So people who are perhaps involved with a school or teachers, we've got an education pack on the Times Educational Supplement website and on our own website. There's lots and lots of things that schools can do to use them. And of course, don't forget the cemeteries, these fantastic Victorian cemeteries that we have. It isn't all about churchyards. And they're just, absolutely huge, great places, teeming with wildlife and fascinating history to be gleaned just by wandering about. So, there's also sort of monument recording that people do. So people more interested in history. There's a lot of monument recording goes on, just noting down the inscriptions before they erode away. Putting them on a database, that sort of thing. So it's sort of things like that, really. If people want to contact Caring for God's Acre, how would they go about it? Best thing to do is to just nip onto our website and find the contact page, and there's phone numbers and emails, and just a general sort of contact email as well. That's the quickest way, honestly. I mean, we're on social media as well. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and sign up for our newsletters, and that will give you a bit of a flavour of what we do. But we're always really pleased to hear from people. You know, we're part of our job is to answer queries and to just try and help people on this sort of journey along to making the space a little bit more greener. I think another thing just to add in is that at the moment the church is committed to zero carbon really quite quickly, which is a huge commitment by them. It's really impressive when you think how many listed buildings they have, big stone echoing cold buildings. You know, good for them. It's a really big challenge. And the management of the churchyard will, of course, come into that. So, you know, driving petrol mowers over it quite so much as they are now might, you know, they're going to have to sort of look at all of their management practices, absolutely from, you know, building materials to management through to how they look after the churchyard to keeping their veteran trees growing as long as possible with all the carbon that's locked up in those. So, you know, I think an awful lot of church communities are thinking, golly, how on earth do we do this? So people with that expertise might find that you know that the church would be very willing to listen and might need a little bit of help. You know, an individual sort of, you know, your local church, even if you never set foot in it, if that's an expertise you have, you might find that that would be really helpful to them.
So go get involved if you think you can help protect these unique sites. Thank you, Harriet, for the interview. Thank you for listening, and to those of you who've left ratings and reviews. It is helping, and I hope you'll take the time to do it if you haven't already. I'm off to inhale the steam off some menthol crystals, so here's Dr. Ian Bedford with advice on what to do with that butterfly that's just taken up residence in your bedroom.
With summer over and autumn well and truly underway, the frenetic buzz of insect life within our gardens would have sadly come to an end. With the social insects closing down their nests and the solitary species having reached the part of their life cycle in which they try and survive through the often bleak winter months that lie ahead. And this includes all of our resident butterfly species, some of which will overwinter as eggs, some as caterpillars, and a few as pupae, all hidden away amongst the plants, hopefully remaining undisturbed and protected from freezing winds and frosts until the following spring. But there's also just 4 of these butterfly species that'll remain as adults throughout the winter: the peacock, the small tortoiseshell, the comma, and the brimstone. Although with our changing climate, this might soon include the migrant red admiral and clouded yellow as well. Overwintering as a dormant adult, though, is probably the riskiest stage for a butterfly, and unfortunately, many won't survive to fly again the following spring. Besides being found and eaten by insectivorous birds and rodents, the dormant butterflies will also perish if they run out of energy, having not found enough nectar during autumn. They might also have chosen an unsafe hideaway, such as a log pile destined for a wood burner, or a shed containing dormant spiders that they can't escape from in the spring. Many butterflies will also die if they've settled in our homes, which often remain too warm for them to fully hibernate. But by knowing the different ways that our resident butterflies endure the winter months, we can definitely help to increase their chance of survival. Leaving the flower borders and hedges undisturbed until spring, for example, will certainly help protect any overwintering eggs, caterpillars and chrysalises, whilst growing plenty of late flowering plants, such as Verbena bonariensis and sedum, will allow the adult butterflies to top up their energy or nectar before they become dormant. Also, carefully releasing or relocating any that enter our homes during autumn, perhaps to an unheated shed or a garage, but remembering to help them escape from the spiders in the spring.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, Please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.